Hello and welcome back to Chronicled, the history of Newcastle United, for the penultimate chapter of our 30-episode walk through the entire 140-year history of the club that began life as Stanley FC in 1881, became Newcastle East End shortly after that, then rebranded famously as Newcastle United in 1892. It's been quite a story, quite a journey, and last week's episode saw us cover the Pardew years and a brush with the Champions League before an implosion left the club relegated after a pretty disastrous spell under Steve McLaren. But there was reason for optimism with Rafa Benitez installed in the dugout, and although he was unable to rescue the team from relegation, he agreed to stay and attempted at least to breathe some life back into the club. The Rafa era is the focus of this week's episode, and joining myself and Paul Joannou to discuss this period in the club's story is a man who literally wrote the book on Rafa. It's ChronicleLive's former Newcastle United editor, Mark Douglas, who is now Northern Football Correspondent at theEIBWpodcast and the author of the book, The Rafalution. Mark, welcome to the episode.
Hello, guys. You okay?
Yes, we're good. We're good. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, you transferred to the iPaper at the end of last year, 2021, after 14 years at the Chronicle, but you're obviously well known to our listeners and in a way responsible for this series, because I actually pitched you the idea, didn't I, for this, if you remember, in early 2021. You basically greenlit it, so and let me get on with it. So thanks for that. Thanks for showing faith and commissioning what's been a really interesting series.
Yeah, bizarre. Still feels a bit bizarre to say former Chronicle, but yeah, it's been good to sort of get into something new. But obviously, the Chronicle always have a massive part of my heart, and I'm glad it's worked out as well as it has. You've taken the ball and run with it, as they say.
We have, and you're the first to acknowledge that your time covering the club coincided with some difficult seasons, shall we say, but the Rafa years, they were probably some of the brightest. Is that fair to say?
I think, yeah, in terms of just everything that was going on around the club, it felt like that. Yeah, I mean, the Pardew fifth place season was the best in terms of the results and in terms of where the club were going. But the season that Newcastle came up from the Championship was probably the most united and the most together time until pretty much now, where it does feel like there's a sense of unity behind the club again. But we had that in a very brief period for a season, I think, in the Championship. Although we'll probably get into it, like halfway through the season, that kind of antagonism sort of started up again. But we definitely had, for a good 6 months, probably the most united and the most I think the most forward-looking that Newcastle were under Mike Ashley. And I don't really understand why he didn't take that blueprint and build on it, but he decided not to. And it was great to work with Benitez at the time, because we had a run of managers who were probably not at the level that Rafa's at. There weren't bad managers. I think some of them that did okay. Pardew did pretty well. McLaren, obviously, he'd done big things in the game, but then you had Rafa, former Champions League winner, previously at Real Madrid, coming to Newcastle. It did feel like surreal, but yeah, I'd say this was amongst the most interesting and for a time very much enjoyable part of covering Newcastle in those 14 years.
Yeah, we'll get into that. We'll get into that properly in the episode. But coming to you, Paul, last week we chronicled the sixth relegation in Newcastle's history since their election at the Football League in 1893, and we're picking up with the club about to embark on the second attempt to bounce back up into the Premier League under the ownership of Mike Ashley. But thanks to the presence of Rafa, there was a real optimism around the place that summer, wasn't there?
There was. United were back in Tier 2, of course. And once more needed a quick return to the cash-rich Premier League. And Rafa made sure that happened. He was hugely experienced, and his knowledge was a key part in Newcastle ending up as champions for season 2016-17. And in the end, they really cruised to promotion, as had happened under Chris Hughton 2 or 3 years back. There was much transfer activity in the season as players came and went, of course. Big fees were received for Wijnaldum, Sissoko and Townsend, who all wanted top-level football. United took in around £68 million. New names came: Atsu, Clark, Diarmi, Gamez, as well as Hanley, Hayden, Daryl Murphy, Sells, Yedlin and Matt Ritchie. There was quite a line of them. Dwight Gale came also from Crystal Palace for £10 million to lead the line, and he scored 23 goals. while Richie was hugely effective with another 16 goals. Captain Lascelles was dominant at the back, so all in all, they had a good, strong side for the championship.
Yeah, Mark, what are your memories from this summer? It was inevitable, like players like Sissoko and Wijnaldum would leave, but Rafa seemed to make some really shrewd signings for the championship that Paul was listing off there. So a lot of them are still here, which is quite telling. But it was a busy summer period, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think what was really interesting, I think, about the Benitez summer was that we all kind of fretted. I think, we kind of forget, but at the end of the season that they got relegated, it was not a given that he was going to stay at all. In fact, I mean, for most of the time towards the end of the season, I mean, people around him were sort of saying he's probably not going to stay. So the fact that he did stay, and then what we had, and obviously, like, we've kind of all erased the Mike Ashley era out of our memory in the last few weeks. But what we forget is that Mike Ashley actually, at that point, he turned to Lee Charnley and said, "What Rafa wants, Rafa gets," which was the philosophy of that summer. And I think, look, in the end, obviously, it was inevitable. I think that Sissoko was going to go. It was inevitable that Wijnaldum was going to go as well, because there were two players who were too good for the championship, and Newcastle needed to sell them as well financially. But he was told at the start of that summer, look, if those players stay, they stay, and if you can keep them, if nobody comes in with the bid that we want from them, they will stay, and they will have to stay. So it was quite an interesting summer, really, because they did their business early, they did their business decisively, which is kind of what we always want from Newcastle, especially when they need to. They got Dwight Gale in fairly early on, which I thought was a really important signing. The first signing was a goalkeeper, which was bizarre, and Matt Sells, obviously didn't do much in the end. But what I thought was really interesting was that Benitez was given a free hand to mould the squad how he wanted. And what he did sign some exceptional players. We saw Matt Ritchie and Dwight Gale, I think, were two of the better players in the championship that season. What he did do was strengthen the team in terms of the depth of the squad, because he knew, he'd looked at the championship and seen what they needed to do, and he likened it to almost the Champions League. I'll have to play 3 games in a week. I'll have to play Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday, pretty much throughout the season, especially if we go far in the League Cup, which they did. And he decided he needed, you talk about Hanley there. You talk about Daryl Murphy, who obviously ended up coming into his own for a brief period in the middle of the season and did really, really well. But what he did, which other managers hadn't been able to do, was sign players who were going to bring the level of the squad up. So it wasn't necessarily the superstars. It was your Murphys, your Hanleys, those kind of players. It was, the idea was, look, if we lose a player or if we have to rest a player and rotate, we'll have players of equal ability to come in. And I think that was very much his philosophy from the start. It was actually his philosophy in the Premier League as well. He added numbers because he wanted the squad as a whole to be much stronger than it had been. And I think it was a winning formula, really. I think you could see from early on that they just had too much for a lot of teams in the Premier League. They didn't necessarily have the best starting 11, I don't think, at times. There were other teams. I think we saw Huddersfield that year, didn't we? And Brighton, obviously, in the end, threw away the championship. But they probably had as good a starting 11. Huddersfield, in the end, fell away. But, at times they had players who were performing better than some of Newcastle's players. But Newcastle were just ready for the grind. They did really well for a brief period. They had Shelvey, players like that who were obviously fantastic superstars in that division, but they had enough players to get through the really tricky moments. And I think that was, for me, the big success of what he did in the summer. He had a philosophy in his mind, put it through, and they finished really, really strongly. And they finished with more than enough to spare in the end to go up. Yeah,
the finish was great. The start, I remember, Paul, was very bad. Defeat away to Fulham, then they lost at home to Huddersfield, but it picked up, didn't it? And they got the job done and even managed to secure the title on a dramatic final day.
Yeah, they did stutter at the beginning. They felt the championship was quite a bit different to the Premier League, but they did get underway and reached top of the league and more or less stayed there for a long time and watched by an average of 51,000 at Gallagher. The football wasn't attractive at times, but with Newcastle ground out the results, and as spring approached, they played promotion rivals Brighton, Huddersfield and Reading and were unbeaten. Then they had a poor Easter, and that let in Brighton and Huddersfield especially to close the gap. But both of them lost ground, and on the very last day of the season, Brighton lost at Aston Villa, and Newcastle defeated Barnsley and we took the title. And that was a satisfying end to a season that also saw a League Cup run. As Mark quickly mentioned there, we just missed out on reaching the semi-final and should have really got there. And the meeting with Manchester United after losing to Hull City on penalties. And that was a tie that they really should have won.
Yeah, agree. Mark, any special moments from you for this period, or interesting interactions maybe with Rafa during this season? Because this, of course, was pre-COVID, where journalists could actually attend press conferences in person rather than do them on Zoom. So you probably spent a decent bit of time in his company, I would imagine.
Yeah, we did. I mean, what I loved about Rafa Benitez was if you went along to speak to him, and there were a couple of times when, if this was a time of openness, really, with journalists, I think the club were able to change direction a little bit, and because there was a feeling that actually the owner feels a lot more comfortable with Rafa being there, and Rafa had, I think, negotiated to his contract as well, and said, look, give me the chance to decide how the club operates and things. And one of the things he said was, I don't want any more bans for journalists. I want to welcome everybody back into the fray. So what the club would do, they would invite the local media down to speak to Rafa, and basically what you'd say is, I will go down for an hour and I'll try and get some stuff in my pad for the international break or whatever. And Rafa would sit there for 3 hours with you, with water bottles placed on different parts of the table, telling you tactically how he was going to do this game or what had happened in this game. He'd be throwing questions at you, was sort of saying, so how do we defend this corner? I've got this, and you'd be sitting there going, well, I don't know, you're the manager, you tell me. But that was very much what he tried to do. He tried to get us. His idea was almost educating you. He didn't answer questions; he educated you, and I think obviously it worked really well at Newcastle because we were all kind of like, everybody was with him at the time. So I mean, it was always great for that. I think for me, 3 games stand out really. The Norwich game, very much in the early start of the season. You mentioned there that they had a really bad start, and they did. Obviously they lost the first game. They were terrible against Fulham. Then they were really poor against Huddersfield. Lost that game as well. And they came into the Norwich game. I think they'd won games in between, but they came to the Norwich game. They were a goal down, weren't they? I think approaching the final whistle, and they ended up winning the game with an injury time, wasn't it? It was deep into injury time. I think they were 2-0 down actually. I can't exactly remember, but I think they were 2-0 down, and they ended up winning the game 3-2. I can't remember exactly what happened. It's a while ago now. I do remember that was an incredible 2 goals in injury time to win the game, and just absolutely gave the team lift off. I thought at the time it was absolutely incredible. I also remember a League Cup game against Preston, believe it or not, when Alexander Mitrovic scored, and it felt at the time that Newcastle were building. That was a League Cup game. They had Hull in the next round, and I think, like Paul said, it felt like they should have, they should have gone on and won that. And then finally, for me, the final day of the season was the best moment. But I do remember some moments of genuine discomfort as well. They lost to Fulham at home, got turned over really, really badly by Fulham at the time. Sessegnon absolutely tore them apart. And there was points there where you started to think, are they going to get pushed into the playoffs here? Because Huddersfield were going absolutely fantastically well on the fraction of the budget that Newcastle had. And you did worry that if it had gone into the playoffs, the tension around the ground would have been absolutely incredible. But as it turned out, it was pretty special. I wasn't at the game, but I do remember that they beat QPR by 6 goals to 0 as well, where John Joe Shelby scored a hat trick. I think Lee Ryder gave him a 10 out of 10, one rare 10 out of 10 for him. And that was, those were some, they did have some really, 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 really good moments. But yeah, I think it sort of sticks with me now, like looking back, just how in control Rafa was pretty much from the start. He didn't panic over those two defeats, and his message to everybody was, look, keep doing the things that we're telling you to do. It will come good, and it did in the end. Very much probably the message that he's giving to people at Everton at the moment, and it's probably pretty tricky, I think, at Everton at the moment for him. But when he was at Newcastle, he had everybody behind him. I think that made the difference.
It did, yeah. And Paul, into 2017-18, the fans were very much enjoying the Rafalution and hoping that his presence would maybe inspire Mike Ashley to give the club the investment, financially and emotionally, that it had been lacking.
Yeah, well, that was certainly the hope. With Benitez in charge for a return to the top flight, confidence was very high that that he would secure United's Premier League place. And he did that with ease in the end. His popularity was now just massive. He raided the transfer market, although it has to be said, with limited funds. So new arrivals were largely bargains or loan deals. United now had centre forward Joselou and Brazilian Kennedy in the black and white, as well as Lejeune, Manquillo, Jacob Murphy, and for a short period, Leicester City's international centre forward Slimani. Goalkeeper Martin Dubravka arrived on loan, eventually making that deal permanent. And Mikel Merino came from Borussia Dortmund and looked a good guy before strangely heading back to Spain at the end of the season, then developing into a top player in Spain with Real Sociedad and reaching the international stage. Rafa guided Newcastle to sixth place by October, but then results dipped and the Magpies slipped down the table, continually throwing away leads. And the struggle to score for a long period, Perez top goal getter with 10 goals. But the manager's know-how ensured safety with 4 successive wins in the spring, and they climbed up the table to finish 10th, comfortably securing their Premier League place, as I said. Rafa's ambition, though, was much more than safety, and that ran into a conflict with the owner, I think. Mike Ashley had placed the for sale notice on the club once more, and a long-running and weary takeover saga began. And the owner's relationship with supporters deteriorated, while a working understanding with the manager became somewhat disastrous too.
Yeah.
So things weren't all pretty.
Yeah, you can just see where the relationship starts to sour, and the story takes a downward turn. Mark, this was the start of the big takeover speculation. Amanda Staveley and Murdoch Godosky, they famously attended the Liverpool game at home in September of 2017, and Amanda and Murdoch have been staple of Newcastle United media coverage ever since, haven't they?
Oh, whatever happened to them? Like, has anybody heard from them since? Yeah, I mean, I think this was a period, I think, for me, of a bit of a sliding doors period of like what could have been. Obviously, I think I think at the time, at the end of the championship season, we didn't cover it in the promotion season, but it all started in the kind of January of that year, where suddenly you had people in the background, voices in the background, questioning Rafa's recruitment policy. Why does he need Daryl Murphy? Why he spent all this money on these players, and these players haven't got any resale. Rafa went to the well again in the January and wanted them to loan Andros Townsend. And he said, look, if we can get Andros Townsend in, I think Ruben Loftus-Cheek was the other one as well. If we can get Andros Townsend in, and we can get Loftus-Cheek on loan as well, we not only will we have enough to get us promoted, but we'll also then have built the team for the next year. Newcastle just came back to him and said, Lee Charney said, there's no money. We can't do this Andros Townsend deal. So I think that started the bitterness, really. And then what we had at the end of the season, and we had it every year with Rafa, was, is he going to stay? Is he going to walk away because he's so annoyed at the transfer policy? And of course, 2017, 2018, what started to happen was Newcastle started to look at the finances and said, and ironically, because Mike Ashley wanted to sell, said, there is no money. The only money that you're going to get is from selling players and from any money from the TV money as well. So Rafa ended up basically recruiting pretty much on the cheap in his opinion. He didn't think the squad had moved forward enough to sort of take them forward. I mean, he ended up getting Joselou in the end, and I think rather unfairly, I remember in the press conference actually where he talked about strikers, and he said, if you pay 20 million, you get a striker who will score goals. If you pay 10 million, you get a striker who's kind of like can do some things. If you pay 5 million, you get a striker who's, who maybe can't do any of the things. And they end up paying 5 million for Joselou. So he knew exactly what he was going to get. I mean, he explained that signing to us as like, look, well, he speaks Spanish, so I'll be able to talk to him. He's good in the air and he'll do what I tell him. And that was basically it. He wasn't saying he was a great player. He was just saying he'll do what I tell him. So there he is. And, I think Joselou did okay. And I think, look, I think as much as Mike Ashley deserves a lot of criticism for some of the things that happened at Newcastle, we also have to accept that Rafa Benitez is famously doesn't ever settle for what he gets. He'll always be pushing. He always likes that conflict, trying to get people to do a little bit more and a bit more of what they should do. And I think it's interesting, really, that was that I think probably there was blame on both sides, if I'm being honest. I think Rafa had to accept that they did back him financially in the Championship. So Premier League, they were never going to have as much money. I think what he contended was he'd been lied to. Was what he said. He said they lied to me. They told me I could have certain things, and they wouldn't let me just spend the money how I want to. So I think that was the backdrop against everything. But it was a strange year because they started actually really well. I remember they drew with Liverpool. Jocelyn scored, and they could have won that game, and they were looking really, really strong then. Then they had just a terrible downward spiral where they I remember them losing at home to Watford 3-0, and we all started to worry that they were going to go down. That was a dreadful display. They went to West Brom, obviously got relegated that year, and they were 2-0 down. Got a 2-2, and it was like, and then suddenly it was, I think Rafa came out and said, if we stay up, it'll be a miracle. And, or I will have worked a miracle or something. And that created a lot of tension. And by now, like Paul said, it was very much a full frontal civil war. There was no love lost between either side. But they did. And I think what cemented Rafa's legacy at Newcastle was when the chips were down, they did pull out the performances, and they were always tactically just brilliant displays. I think of the Manchester United win, first game Dubravka had as a Newcastle player. I think a lot of fans didn't know why they'd signed a goalkeeper. They felt they had a decent goalkeeper in Carl Darlow, who's still there, obviously. But he was absolutely inspired. It won them the game. Probably Dubravka's fee was paid off in one game there, because that I think gave them the springboard onto safety. And in the end, they finished the season incredibly well and finished 10th, which Rafa in the end sort of said, he's famous. He liked to tell us that football was a lie, and I think he said that was it wasn't a 10th place finish. It was it gave us a false sense of security going into the next year. And again, in the summer, we had very much, will he stay, won't he stay? And I think in the end he said, I will respect and honour my contract, which was a 3-year contract, so it took him to the next season. But it was again the backdrop of disappointment. But I think what really was interesting is the takeover saga started then, and we had a situation, I think, where by then, and we got a lot of criticism. I remember getting a lot of criticism myself, because I used to write, Mike Ashley wants to sell this club now. He's finished with it. He does not believe. He's tried everything now. He's had Rafa. He just doesn't get football. He doesn't want to get football. He doesn't want to spend any money on football anymore. And by 2017, he had decided, I think he decided a long time before then, but by the time he'd had the fallout with Rafa, and he thought, do you know what? I just can't be bothered with this anymore. And he thought, I'm not going to put any more money into this football club, but I'm going to make sure that it is in a good enough position that when somebody comes in, it's going to be really financially in such a good position that they can then spend money, and they'll be able to work within FFP. And he's basically his attitude from 2017 to 2021 was, I'm not putting any more money in it. I'm going to run it in a skeleton way, because I think I can sell it. And I think he probably thought he would have sold it before 2021. He probably thought it would take 18 months, maybe at tops, 12 months, 18 months at tops. In the end, it took 4 years. And I think what the problem was that the 4 years were quite damaging in between 2017 and 2021. Losing Rafa, obviously, which I know we'll go on to, was, I think, very, very damaging for the football club. But to be fair to Ashley, he made that decision, and then he had to do what he had to do. And I think he was never going to put money in after that. And I think he hopefully we'll find out this month and moving forward that he actually long term, that maybe was the right decision. In the short term, and if he hadn't sold it in 2021, I was really worried about the future of the football club. But as it turned out, I think probably all of that kerfuffle and all that stuff around there, with Staveley in particular coming in, it was damaging for the football club at the time, but long term, obviously, it paid off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Paul, back to onto the pitch matters. How did Rafa's second full season in the Premier League, this is 2018-19, how did that shape up for the club?
Well, it was much the same story as the previous campaign, really. Signings came in. These were largely second rate at best. lacking goals up front, a poor start, all the same facts as the previous season. United failed to win a game until the end of October. They flirted with relegation, then survived with games to spare in 13th spot, and even beat champions Manchester City at St James's Park, the highlight of a forgettable season, really. This time United did spend a bit of money, albeit not at the level of the top clubs. A record 21 million was paid for Miggy Almiron from the USA, but he was largely unknown and untried in the Premier League. Fernandes, Muto, Shaw and Ki Sun Young all arrived too. Salomon Rondon came on loan and showed much endeavour up front and became a popular signing for a short period. He scored 12 goals, with Ayoze Perez again top scorer with 13.
Yeah, again, pragmatic signings, and it was a carbon copy really of the previous season, wasn't it, Mark? And it was a difficult start, but the way the club finished this season, I think they're playing a bit more positive. There was a bit of a 4-3-3 happening with Almiron, Rondon and Perez up front. There was a bit of optimism that he'd managed to turn the team into a more offensive club.
Absolutely, yeah. I think probably partially what was so regrettable about the fact that he left at the end of this season was the fact that they did look as if they were clicking towards the end of that year. Liverpool came to St James's Park, and this was a Liverpool team that went on to win the league next year, and were in the middle of almost like a 12-month period where they were almost unbeatable.
Mm-hmm.
No team at home could do it, and I think they won the European Cup or the Champions League, in this period as well. And Newcastle gave them a hell of a game at St James's Park. It was a fantastic contest, a really, really, really top game. And they obviously went to Leicester and won there as well. I mean, they just generally, I think, at that point towards the end of the season, looked really, really strong. Having at the start of the season been absolutely pitiful, terrible. The Cardiff game, I think I remember that 0-0 was, one of the worst games of the Rafa era, definitely. But towards the end, they seemed as if they'd started to build something. Salomon Rondon was absolutely exceptional this year. Really, really worked so well with Ayoze Perez, and it felt like Newcastle were getting somewhere. It felt like look, give him some money in the transfer market, give him some money, give him what he wants, go and sign Rondon, and we will be motoring, and we will start to think that Newcastle can be relevant again. But obviously it wasn't to be for many of the reasons that we've talked about before. But yeah, I think it was a strange season. Probably the sort of flipped it round from last season, where they started quite well the season before. They started really badly this year, and they almost got to Christmas, and you feared that they were in real trouble. As it was, they kind of they did turn it around. Some canny loan signings again. They always seem to play the loan market quite well. In Rafa's time, and they did end up doing quite well there as well. Obviously, funnily enough, Steve Bruce ended up doing quite well in the low market as well in both his seasons. So they did tend to kind of do January okay, and it did help. But I think the big memory for me of this season was just how much the "is he going to stay" narrative dominated everything that season. If it wasn't that, it was the takeover. And this was the year that we had. I think this was the year where at Christmas we had. In the summer before it, we had the sort of Dubai-based consortium. No, that was the season after. It was Christmas. We had Peter Kenyon was within weeks was going to take over, and then in the summer it was Midhat Kidwai and the Dubai-based consortium, who turned out to be a mirage. I don't think there was anything at all in that, but the Kenyan one, I think there was some. He did have a very serious financial backer who ended up going out of ended up not having that sort of backing in the end. So takeover and Rafa's future dominated everything. We almost couldn't enjoy the football because all of that stuff was going on off the pitch, and it did become very much. I think this was a period probably from about 2019 to 2021 where literally I think you had so little talk about football. It was just takeover. Is Benitez staying? Takeover. Is Benitez staying? Takeover. Is Benitez staying? And then the end of the summer, which I'm sure you'll probably get onto now, was just painful. weeks and weeks and weeks of not knowing whether Rafa was going to stay, and then obviously having all this stuff going on with Dubai, which ended up being nothing, despite the fact that they were telling us it was going to happen. It was a very painful way to end what should have been something to celebrate. You know, I think the Rafa era for me was enjoyable at the start, and by the end it was painful. It was really painful. And I think probably for fans it felt the same as well. There were some really good moments, but just an aching sense of what might have been. And, you know, if I'm being honest, I think Rafa made the wrong decision to leave, because you look at him now, where he is now, he's never going to have that level of love that he had when he was at Newcastle. He'll never have that again. He'll never have the freedom, I think, to make mistakes, which he had at Newcastle as well. And, you know, if he'd have stayed and maybe signed another year or 2 years, I think Ashley wanted him to sign a long-term contract. And if he'd have signed that long-term contract, I think the club would have ended up getting taken over, and he would have been in charge for that as well. And, you know, which I think was what Staveley and her team wanted anyway. They wanted Rafa, and I think they even considered going back in for him a few months ago as well. But obviously they couldn't in the end. But it was just a massive sense of regret for me at the end of it, you know, having chronicled it and seen how great he was for long periods. And I think he got the club. He was the right fit for the club at the time. And it was just a real shame that it didn't go any further than it ended up.
Yeah. It's a modern tragedy, isn't it? The story of Rafa at Newcastle United. But Paul, for the record, can you talk us through how it officially ended for Rafa at Newcastle?
Well, as Mark's indicated, long before the season's end, the rift between Rafa and the owner widened, and very few considered it could be healed. His vision was on a different planet to that of the one away Ashley. At the end of the season, the Spaniard headed to China, and United had lost one of Europe's top managers. Newcastle fans were utterly frustrated and incensed. Protests against the owner reached fever point, not helped by an unpopular replacement as boss in Tyneside-born and past Manchester United hero Steve Bruce. He arrived at a very difficult time for him personally, and was hardly given a chance by anyone to lead the team he supported as a kid. The mood around St James's Park became, you know, very toxic, and that continued for several months.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd told a Newcastle fan at the end of that season that Rafa would be effectively allowed to walk away and replaced by Steve Bruce, who at the time was toiling at the wrong end of the Championship, I think they might have, you know, self-combusted. And Mark, what was the situation like that summer? Was Steve Bruce, was he at the end of a long shopping list of managers, and he was the one in the end who said, yes, I'll take this thankless task on?
Well, funnily enough, I think there was two managers I think that would have probably satisfied Newcastle fans that Newcastle considered. I think Brendan Rodgers was the first one who was very much, there was a bit of a dance going on, I think, between Rodgers' associates and what was going to go on at Newcastle. I think there was almost that, you know, will Rafa go to Leicester, and then Brendan Rodgers will probably end up coming from Celtic to Newcastle. As it turned out, in the end, you know, he ended up going to Leicester, and I think that was a good move for him. But he was keen on the Newcastle job. I know from people around him that he would have taken the Newcastle job, and I think that would have been a good next move. But then what the hierarchy really tried to do, and they really pushed for, and they got a decent way with him as well, was going for Mikel Arteta, who obviously was at Manchester City at the time, was Pep Guardiola's number 2, and it appealed to Arteta. Definitely appealed to Newcastle. But I think what happened in the end was Arteta did his background research, and obviously I think he did end up speaking to people around Rafa as well, and it was very much the message was, look, you're going to go in there and you're not probably going to get backed, you're not going to get what you want. And obviously in the end Arteta ended up going to Arsenal, so it probably worked out okay for him, but he was the number one choice. He was the one that they wanted. But I think what happened was they got further on in the summer, and I think the problem that had happened in the summer was that Newcastle had waited a long time for Rafa to make an official call. They kind of hung around, I think, thinking he'll blink before we do, and I think he might end up coming back into the fray. But it was, you know, there was just by then all trust had gone between the two parties. But Newcastle's approach, if you spoke to them, you spoke to Lee Charnley at the time, was we didn't make any attempt to go for anybody else while Rafa was still under contract. We wanted him to stay. That was the only thing that we wanted. Mike Ashley, I think, ended up giving an interview, didn't he, in the Daily Mail, where he spoke about what had happened in that summer, and that was his version of things. Obviously, Rafa gave a slightly different version of things, but they said we went right to the end of it. That left them with not much time before the start of the season. Arteta didn't happen, and they got to the point where it was like, right, we need somebody in who's experienced, who knows the game, who we can get, and we feel, you know, we'll come in and be able to steady the ship. And that's, I think, how they ended up at Steve Bruce, which, you know, I think we all know what happened in the end with Steve Bruce. But I think, playing devil's advocate, he did for 2 years what the job that Newcastle wanted him to do was keep them in the Premier League, and imagine, you know, what could happen if there's a takeover. And I think probably by hook or by crook, they ended up doing that. And I think that was the to me the sort of, you know, I think viewing it back, I think like now in the history podcast, probably in 20, 30 years time, you'll look back and say, reevaluate what Steve Bruce did and say he did the job that was asked of him. And actually probably, when the heat's been taken out of the situation, you'll say fair play. I think probably it's a bit too fresh in the memory, isn't it, for everybody to say fair play, well done, Steve Bruce, for keeping us in the Premier League, because, you know, it was a pretty painful 2 years for a long way. It had its moments where it was okay, but I think probably it didn't quite happen. But that summer was just a case in point, I think, of how, if Newcastle had communicated better, if they'd have, you know, done things in a better way, then it would have been okay. But as it was, they let Rafa Benitez run rings around them, I think, to be perfectly honest with you. And they should have made a better attempt, I think, to keep him. I think they should have just let him sign Salomon Rondon. I think things would have been okay. You know, they should have given him the budget that he wanted, gone and let him sign the players. He would have signed a short-term contract extension, because I think he went to China, but he told us off the record in the press conferences before then, he didn't think China was a viable and credible football project. So what happened there? I think he probably just ended up thinking, well, I'm going to go there. It's going to be very lucrative for me, and I'm also going to get to build something a little bit, and then I'll keep myself in the shop window to come back to England, which is obviously what has happened. But I think for both parties, I think there'll be a measure of regret around what happened in the summer when they look back at it in the long term, you know, because it didn't help, and it didn't help the club. I think they had 2 very difficult years in the run up to 2021, and I think they're paying the price now, because they're at the bottom of the league pretty much, you know, and they need to do business now, don't they, to get themselves out of relegation trouble. But a very strange time, and difficult time, I think. Difficult time as a journalist as well, to cover the club for those 2 years, because there was so much frustration and so much anger, I think, towards what was going on in Newcastle. You know, don't forget they lost so many season ticket holders as well in that summer as well when he left, that you couldn't write positive stories. It was very, very difficult. Nobody wanted to hear them, you know, which is the opposite now. Probably the team's still losing games, but people just want positive stories because they sort of want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. So it's a very different situation now. But I think, you know, just such a sense of regret around Rafa. Steve Bruce, it was an impossible job for him. I don't think he should have taken it in the first place, to be honest with you. I think he knew what was going to happen, and he was warned it was what was going to happen. But, you know, he got the chance to manage Newcastle, and he kept them in the Premier League, and probably to outsiders, they'd say his reputation was enhanced.
Yeah, fascinating. We're going to be covering that in the last episode of Chronicle next, the Steve Bruce era and the takeover. But really fascinating couple of years under Rafa Benitez, turned into just such a dramatic poker game, basically, between Mike Ashley and Rafa. And by the sounds of it, I don't think anyone won. Both parties came out of it badly, not how they intended it to go. But yeah, it was a real roller coaster that really epitomised the entire story of Newcastle United. It got a lot of things wrong, a lot of things right, and we're still there at the end of it. And of course, for further reading on this, we should point listeners in the direction of a book you wrote, Mark, The Rafalution. I did mention it at the start. It was obviously a significant period of your career, because you did literally decide to write about it.
Yeah, I think what was interesting was the end of the summer. Reach has a sports book department, and I just sent them an email about halfway through the season and said, "Look, there's something really interesting building here, and and I've kind of been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Rafa, and would you be interested in the book?" And they sort of said yes. And that was the period where they started to lose games. So I kind of thought, well, nobody's going to buy the book if they don't get promoted because there's no story there. But I kind of I thought I still fancy doing this book. And we ended up getting to the point where it was like, if they don't get promoted, there's no book. So is it worth starting to write it? And in the end, I think I wrote it in about 14 days or 15 days or something. So it was a bit of it nearly killed me, honestly. It was absolutely incredible run to get it. I was writing thousands of words a day, but I really enjoyed doing it. And, it was a great experience to do it. And I think what it made me realize was going back through all my notes and going back through all those kind of things was just how methodical Benitez had been, because everything that he said at the start of the season in August happened. Everything he said, every reason for signing a player when you look back at the press conferences in August, they all happened in the end. And I think that's why I have so much respect for him, and I still think he's an elite coach. He's very much a singular kind of coach. I don't think there's too many like him out there. And he really believed that Newcastle United, he could take Newcastle United into, he could be the man who unlocked it. And I don't think he was that far away at times. I think towards the end of his time, he really did bring in a new mentality to Newcastle United, but unfortunately, he just wasn't allowed to take the next step with it. But yeah, I really enjoyed writing the book. Very enjoyable time working with him in press conferences. Incredibly political guy as well. Off the record, some of the stuff he said was just incredible. He would sort of say, I remember before the season started, me, Lee Ryder, and I think Miles Stafford from the Shields Gazette all stood with him before the season started, and some of the stuff he was coming out with, off the record about, the Mike Ashley and stuff was just, incredible. But that the whole 14 years. I mean, Alan Pardew took us down the quayside once, and to try and run rings around Joe Kinnear, it was that was just Mike Ashley's Newcastle United. They just couldn't get a grip of everything. It was just incredible, really. Yeah. And Rafa relished that. He loved it. I know he always seemed. He loved it. The political side of it, he's always said he wasn't bothered about it, but he loved it. And he always won. He always won the political battles. And that was why he's sort of seen as a legend at Newcastle, and Mike Ashley's seen as a villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Politics with Rafa, down the quayside with Pardew. Save that one for your second book, I think.
Yeah, I know it was...
Legends and Villains is a good title.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Mark, for doing this today. And there we have it, listener. We've covered 138 years of club history, the Rafalution. It's been and gone. Benitez restored Newcastle at the top flight, and he was building the foundations for something, but sadly, it wasn't a project Mike Ashley seemed to have the appetite for, and Newcastle have been left to tick along for the time being. And just 2 more years to go in our series, and we're going to round that off neatly next week in episode 30 of Chronicled. That's going to cover 2019 to the present day. So that's Steve Bruce, an 18-month takeover saga, and the hopefully glorious future ahead for the new Newcastle United. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, Mark, for joining, and please stay subscribed, everyone, to the Everything is Black and White podcast via whichever podcast platform you're listening to us on. Hit the notification bell so you get that final episode as soon as it lands, and follow us on social media. We're at ChronicleNUFC on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Video versions of these episodes are all available to watch on our YouTube channel, which is the EIBW podcast on YouTube. And remember, stay up to date with everything black and white by subscribing to our daily Newcastle United newsletters. Completely free to do this. I'll put a link to sign up in our show notes, and if you tap that and select Sport Newcastle United Updates, enter your email address, you'll be signed up to receive all the latest Newcastle United content from ChronicleLive every single day. So yeah, thanks so much for listening to Chronicle, the history of Newcastle United, with me, Matt Ketchell, Paul Joannou, and our special guest, Mark Douglas.